Welcome everyone to Closing Time with Pat and Denis, episode 2. Today we're going to talk about compensation, the topic not many people dare to talk about. So, right, Pat?
Oh yeah, that's
Yeah.
always a dicey one whenever you're talking about comp on both sides of the equation, right?
So we're
and the employee.
Yeah, we're demystifying for sales leaders out there, kind of VP, SVP, EVP, CRO, at mostly tech companies, I think we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
And this is kind of our understanding. Pat has a lot more experience than me in this area, but we'll both talk about it. And so Pat, let's kick this off. Let's get straight to the point.
Yeah.
Can you break down a real life example of like comp plans you've kind of seen for like that CRO or a step down from CRO, maybe VP, SVP in a startup?
Yeah, I can do that. I think one thing that I should note though is that it's somewhat dependent on what, whether it's industry or what type of, company you're starting in or getting into, in terms of the stage of the company. And I guess I would flip it back to you, Dennis. I would say maybe we can use you as an example. So if you were, out there and somebody asked you, whether it was part of the executive team or the board, what are you looking to do or what are you looking for? How would you characterize that as a CRO?
If they were asking me what potential
what
compensation
are you looking for exactly? Because
I would say,
so to speak.
Yeah, I would say that. So I would say it depends on like the size of the company and like how much can that company pay individuals and everything. And that really depends on like if you're going early stage with a lot of tech startups, they're willing to pay or to give more equity a lot of the time, but you might sacrifice on like base salary or variable and so on and so forth. The variable piece might be less certain as well, like in an early stage. But at the same time, if you hit good with that early startup, the variable might be really good. Because it's probably going to be more of a percentage of the deals and the percentage of the revenue. While bigger companies I found have more like kind of on target variable and stuff. So what do I think? I think in sales in general, it's typically in smaller companies, it's typically like 50-50 kind of base or variable. And then advice for people, really dig into that variable component. If you're like understanding a role, like ask questions like what was the typical achievement of the sales team last year, or what's the typical sales productivity per seller, and kind of dig into the numbers a bit, just to make sure that you're cross-referencing them a bit.
And I think, as you just mentioned, right? I mean, depending on what stage of company you're getting in and what industry, in the world of startups, right? Which are you getting into the SaaS or, type of companies that are doing operational improvements, or you're doing analytics, or are you getting in on infrastructure type startups or security or whatever it happens to be? That also has a bearing on what the compensation plan could potentially look like in terms of whether it's base compensation, whether it's on target earnings, et cetera. And so I would answer it that it's somewhat dependent on what the opportunity is that you're looking at. But to give you kind of like the core components, obviously what you've just discussed, right? So there's what is your base salary going to be? And this is for leadership now, not necessarily for just sellers, right? But what's your base and what's your on target earnings going to be, which means base and your variable compensation. And the other thing that you're going to want to, I'll say, when you get whether it's an offer letter or it's an employment agreement or whatever it happens to be, is you want to make sure that they are pretty clear about what the role and a summary of what the responsibilities are going to be, so that there's no disconnect in terms of what they're expecting and what you're expecting. So just something to think about that should be part of a compensation plan. And in the variable, like you said, sometimes, depending on how new the company is or not, or, what stage they're at. I've seen it where, and I think it's a good way to do this, which is if, let's say it's 50-50 base and variable. I've seen it where the variable ends up being a percentage of it is tied to overall company KPIs or
Oh,
goals,
yeah.
right? Whether
Yeah.
that's revenues, or that's customers, or it's profitability, it's reduction in costs in certain functions in the organization, whatever it
Yeah.
happens to be.
A new product line sometimes as well, right? Might be something. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Right. And so that's one component of it. And then there's the rest of that variable is a percentage is then associated specifically to your goals and metrics, whether that's revenue or customers or expansion of customers or whatever it happens to be. So those are kind of the core things that you need to understand. And then you get into the things like, what kind of, some startups have really, really good benefits because they're finding it hard to find really, really talented people. So they have to, and there's competition with the larger companies. So they have to really, make it lucrative, not lucrative, but make it beneficial, benefits and things like that to try to offset that. And then there's, if you're going to a startup, there's these things like, I call it termination or severance type of consideration that you need to think about, because as you know, in startups, you never know what is going to happen in a startup, right? I mean, the market could completely change on you, and all of a sudden, your company is kind of like it's dead on arrival, so to speak. It could be a case where there's merger or acquisition or roll-up type of activity. If you're venture-backed or if there's a private equity or growth firm involved, that could be happening. Or it could just be outright, you guys end up getting bought out or something like that. And that's why it's really important that you pay attention to the severance, component of that, which is around, separation, basically. Whether it's termination or if it's, you decide to leave or whatever it happens to be. And then the other things that you're going to want to look at is, if there is equity involved, which there typically is in startups and stuff like that, you're going to want to understand that couple things. Number one, you understand the financials of the company, right? So that's usually expressed in what they call a cap table, which is it tells you who are all the owners and what type of equity they have in the company, and whether that's whether that's common stock, whether that's preferred stock, whether that's convertible notes and warrants. I mean, there's all sorts of ways companies are capitalized, but debt, whatever it happens to be. So you're going to want to have some understanding of what the cap table looks like for the company, and hopefully, whatever opportunity that you're pursuing, they're going to share that with you, especially if you're going to be their lead executive for the selling organization, sales, go-to-market organizations. You really do need to understand that so that you can, I'll call it, they'll probably provide you with, a incentive plan, equity or stock incentive plan. Most companies have that for, their employees and that sort of thing. You're going to want to understand that, because understanding those then gives you a sense of what you can or can't do with respect to the equity portion, right? And so, for example, if there is a change in control, whether it's through M&A, whether it's through a roll-up with a VC or whatever it happens to be, right? You're going to want to be able to have a component in your employment agreement that talks about that. In the event of a change in control, what does that mean for me? And you need to have that in there, because it's almost like, I don't want to, kind of paint the wrong picture here, but it's almost like marriage, right? When you go into a marriage, everybody thinks it's all going to be wonderful and successful and you're going to last forever and stuff like that. But there are things that happen during the course of your marriage that if you didn't somehow have an understanding of what's the outcome if this circumstance happened up front, that's the only time that you're going to have to be able to make sure that it's equitable for everybody, right? Yeah, make it right by everybody. So, there's a thing that I call it, in the event of a change of control, what are the stipulations with respect to, what does that mean in terms of my salary or compensation, right? What does that mean in terms of, my equity, and how does that vest or not vest, or, what does that mean in terms of my position in the new entity, whatever that's going to be, all those types of things. And that's another component that is really important for people in their comp plans, especially if you're going to be a leader in a startup.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great. And I was going to say, on the cap table piece, in your experience, like, are companies pretty forthcoming with that, or not so much, or kind of a mixed bag?
If it's a company that is seriously wanting to engage with you and would like to bring you on, they will usually be forthcoming, and usually the CFO, and you're going
Yeah,
to probably interview with board members and things like
yeah,
that, right? If you're
yeah,
a
yeah,
startup,
yeah, yeah,
they will probably respect that you're actually asking those questions and think you have a reasonable amount of acumen, because I think sometimes, the term sales or sales leader or stuff like that is sometimes, doesn't always have the best connotation. But
mm,
I think you will find that if they understand that you're actually a sales executive and you're a leader in the company, and
yeah,
you understand what it is that is, at stake with respect to the success or, not success of the company, I think they'll be willing to do that.
yeah,
Most of the ones that when I interview with them, it's like I ask them for all, and they usually will do that, right?
yeah, 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 yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, the one thing I'm just thinking about is with like individual contributors, so direct sellers themselves, and then trying to make that leap in the organization to like maybe a
Yeah.
VP next, or maybe in the UK that might be called sales director, and then up
Yeah.
to VP, SVP, CRO.
Mhm.
It's usually, from what I've seen, it's like if someone's a very good individual contributor, they might be making quite a good bit of money in their variable.
Yeah, their cash compensation will be really
Yeah,
good.
yeah, and like their variable could be much higher, or well, it could be 1.5 times maybe their base or something if they're doing really well.
Yeah.
Even more sometimes if it's like a smaller. Well, I guess some of the big SaaS like Salesforce and people, IBM and stuff, I think they pay very good compensation in that regard as well. But the point I was going to make is I think some individual sellers where they're actually making for what they know is like quite a lot of money, they're like, oh, why would I jump up to manage a team to only maybe make a little bit less, or maybe stay
Hmm.
around the same, but they know it's a ton more work. Um,
Yeah.
I do think advice for them is kind of like, uh, that can be the case, but you're never going to make it up to SVP CRO level if you don't take that step up. Um,
Yeah.
if that's what you're interested in,
Yes.
long term.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that, Pat?
Yeah. So I was, in my career, I actually happened to be one of those folks. This was earlier in my career, and I was a sales person,
Yeah.
and it was in a company, where I don't even know if I could say the company, but so I was doing extremely well. And in one year, my customer, who was one of the largest customers globally for our company, was having a conversation with me and saying something to the effect of like, "Yeah, I heard that somebody in your company was making more cash compensation than the
The
CEO.
CEO. Funny.
Guess who that somebody was?" Yeah. So I was like, "There's a little," yeah. I was like, "I'm going, oh, really?" But yeah. So there's this portion where you, as an individual, are you willing to, in knowing that if you decide to go from individual contributor and you're wildly successful, yet you
Yeah.
want to go into management, you got to be thinking about a couple things. First of all, first line management, in my opinion, is probably the hardest job in any company, whether it's a startup or it's
Wow.
a larger company,
You
because
think?
you
Yeah.
have you have all the responsibility and no authority. That's really the first
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of like you got to kind of pay your dues and learn, these things about what it is to be a leader, and learn how to put together a plan and learn how to
Yeah. Yeah.
motivate people, et cetera, right? Um, and so you got to kind of get your head around that and know that you're not going to be compensated as well. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to be terrible, but it's your cash compensation. You'll have a higher OTE, but your leverage on the variable part won't be as great as it is on the, and the individual contributor plan. And so once you kind of cut your teeth and you're okay with that, because now it's about everybody but you, right? It's not about you
Mm.
anymore when you're a seller. It's about everybody but you as a first point. And then, if you're liking that and then you want to take on more responsibility because you enjoy the aspects of being a leader that are not the process and tactical things, like you like developing people and you like, putting together strategies or plans that to help your team be
Yeah.
successful and things like that. And then you want to learn how to do that with other leaders, then that's a good path to start going to. So from a director to a VP or whatever it happens to be. and that's a different, that's a whole different, I'll call it, transition that you need to make, because you, in each of the cases, right, you're kind of going from doing their job to now, actually being in that job.
Yeah.
And you're doing the same thing when you make the leap to managing managers, right? And I remember my introduction to that was I ended up getting promoted to being a manager, and I was a peer with the guy that managed me. And then I became his manager, was my introduction. And so then when I got promoted again to be the manager of the managers, it was a region that I was responsible for. And now all of a sudden I was his boss. So this was he was my boss, then I was his peer, then I was
wow.
And that's a whole different kind of, this happened to me early in my career, as you had mentioned.
Yeah.
And there you have to get your head around the leadership aspects. And then how do you maximize, how do you build a high performance team and maximize their abilities and their, outcomes and things. And like I said, it's all about, now it's even more so about everybody but you.
Yep.
And that's the big transition that you have to be able to make. Because if you can't make that and you're not inspired or motivated by that, then you'll be miserable and you won't be making as much money. Now, the part that's good about that is that from a compensation standpoint, your cash comp will go up and things like that, proportion your OTE and that sort of thing. But where you really get kind of like hopefully it's the brass ring, so to speak, is that you typically will get more equity in the company.
Yes.
And when you're working in startups, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get to where your equity will, totally, shadow over what you were making from a cash compensation perspective. And, the multiplier effect, right, will be coming to play. So,
yeah. And to that point, on equity, like how much should you think that people like going into the, let's just say the CRO role, because that's the one really where you should be getting some equity. Like how much should you be asking for or receiving, or any benchmarks around that you're aware of?
Yeah. So in general, and I don't want to say it's specific to the opportunity and what industry you're in and things like that, but for startups in general, right, for technology startups, let's just say that, it's somewhat dependent on the stage of the company, and not all stages are working. Sometimes you have Series A, but there's Series A2 or A3 type of thing, right? But in general, kind of at Series A level, you should be, expecting somewhere along the lines from an equity perspective. And it depends on what the capital table looks like as well. So, I don't want to dismiss that. So don't get kind of, I made a mistake early on thinking, oh, I got this many shares but that as a percentage of the total outstanding shares wasn't that much. I thought, oh, whoops, I guess, so it's more about what percentages is what's important, but that's why you need to know what the cap table looks like. But A is somewhere between, anywhere from 1 to 3 or 4%. Then when you get into Series B, which, they probably have product market fit and you're getting some customer traction and that sort of thing, and trying to figure out how do they scale that and transition. That's probably more in the lines of, kind of, I'll call it anywhere from 0.75% to like 2% is probably on the higher end of that range. And then when you get to C and D, and that's kind of, I'll call it, they're getting traction, but maybe they're trying to enter new markets or expand their TAM, whatever it happens to be. That can be anywhere from 0.5% to 1.5% is typically what I've seen in terms of the blend of equity. Provided it's a relatively clean cap table. Like
They're
really committed to, the person in there.
Yeah, and we would say that like with this, it really depends on that company. Like if it's this is what I guess a lot of companies that are backed with capital from venture or PE or something, like things that are more like bootstrapped and stuff are quite different. And or like if just you're not in as much of a tech company where there's like really high margins, I would add as well, right, Pat?
Yeah, that makes a difference. But I agree with you. I think that what you would get out of a venture-backed type of organization in terms of percentages of equity is typically higher than what you would get where the primary investors or the, I'll call it the more majority investors are now growth PE, which is not the same thing as PE, but for startups, right? So growth PE, they're probably down in the lower end of the range.
Yeah.
That's an important distinction versus And then if it's already been bootstrapped or they haven't taken any outside investment, then that's probably a little bit more of a, I happen to have been in one of those companies. That's a little bit more, I don't know that I have this is kind of the range. It just depends on what the mindset is of whether it's founder owners or if they brought in some leadership and they now want that leadership to bring in the right CRO or head of the, customer facing organizations. It could go a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. And then, outside of like, base, variable, and equity, like what kind of other benefits do you recommend that like candidates should be valuing in their negotiation?
So I would say it's somewhat dependent. Well, first of all, it depends on if you have a family or not, if you're doing this, because that will weigh a little bit differently. But I'm going to go on the assumption you probably have some kind of family or relationship or whatever.
You know what someone said to me recently? They said, if you have a family, you have a high burn rate. You need cash.
Exactly right. I used to, one of the sales leaders early in my career that I reported into when I was a first-time manager used to say to me, I want to know you have a high overhead to deal with there, Pat. You guys want, go buy a house, go buy all sorts of stuff. If you got high overhead, then I know I got you. You're going to be producing. So,
funny. That's funny.
But and I would tell you, so in addition to the base salary and variable compensation stuff like that, I would call it, and this is in no particular order, but you're going to want to be thinking about, I call it the soft landing package, right? And that's in the event of some kind of business thing, whether it's a roll up, it's downsizing, it's M&A, it's whatever it happens to be. So, and that's really around the severance piece. Right. So make sure that you have in your agreement with the company, right? Make sure it's very clearly stated out what severance looks like for you in the event of whatever it happens to be, as long as it's not, you're being terminated for cause, right? So for not cause, or if it's downside or whatever, right? That's not cause. So you want to have a good, I call a soft landing package, right? So that's, what does that look like in terms of especially in the selling world, right? What does that look like in terms of, how many months or years or whatever it happens to be of my base salary, and then how much of the efforts that had accumulated to date would I get in terms of my variable and that sort of health benefits, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing is what you should be hopefully have as part of your package, or you should be thinking about instead of just, salary and variable, which is, the equity and your ability to, get a reasonable amount, meaning something that's in the range that we just discussed. And then how could you accumulate more or take advantage of, this large sum of equity? So things like, is there a early exercise clause in their stock plan, right? That's an interesting thing that you could do, where you're saying, I think we got, we're going to be a rocket ship here. And so I'm going to want to go ahead and maybe not but exercise some equity early of what I know I'm going to vest a year from now or whatever it happens to be. And you do that for tax reasons here in the United States, right? Because then it gets treated as capital gains as opposed to like a regular income type of thing. Also, do they have opportunities to trade cash comp for equity comp, right? Something that could be in deferred comp or whatever it happens to be. So, so that's the second thing I would tell you to kind of focus on. And there's a lot of detail that goes into that we probably can't get into here. If somebody wants to, talk about that, you and I can happily, click a link and we'll go ahead and try to get in touch with you. And then the last thing is you're going to want to try to negotiate or get the agreement, your employment agreement, is what I call change of control provisions.
Yeah.
And that's this idea of, okay, if there is some kind of, business event that happens, and in particular, if it's a change of control, because business is business. You never know what's going to happen. I was at one company where it's like, I came on board and then 9 months later, we ended up getting acquired, right?
Yeah.
I wasn't thinking that was what was going to happen, but it did. And it was like, whoa, that was quick, that type of thing. So this idea of change of control, what does that mean? And there's terms that you hear like a single trigger or a double trigger. And then what happens in respective vesting and a change of control, and how does that work? And all sorts of details that go into that. But those are probably the three things: the soft landing package, the equity piece of it, and what, meaning how can you get more or take advantage of that program, and then the change of control.
Yeah, great. And that single trigger, double trigger thing is all about
Yeah.
like accelerated vesting if there is a
Yes.
change of control, right?
Yeah, it really has to do with, if it's, change of control, meaning you're the one that's, now going to be on the outside looking in, or, you're getting acquired, or there's a merger,
Yeah.
or whatever it happens to be, right? It's really about, here's the criteria that suggests that, you now are, this is affecting you. So what does that
Yeah.
mean? That means, okay, if this happens and this happens, then you get this kind of acceleration of your
Yes.
equity and this kind of acceleration of your severance and whatever happens to be.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
the common terms are single trigger and double trigger, but yeah.
Yeah. And is there any other kind of pitfalls that you'd recommend to people about avoiding, like in relation to stock options or vesting schedules?
I would tell you, don't be afraid to ask for whether it's the financials of the company, whether that was previous years, current year, or any pro forma stuff that they've done for the subsequent years. I would tell you, don't be afraid to ask for that. And actually, I think it's very reasonable to ask that. And if they're not willing to provide that information, then they're either not serious about you as a candidate, or you might want to question whether you want to, continue on and be part of that company from a transparency standpoint. And then the second thing, and we talked about this earlier, which is, you should ask for a cap table, because that is going to have an impact on your equity, and what you can get in terms of what the series they think that they're in, and who the investors are, what types of stock is it what percent are common versus what percentage are preferred, and what percent are warrants, and any kind of convertible notes and things like that. Don't be afraid to ask for that as well. So because I think the other stuff we've kind of covered here, but that to me was probably the biggest learning that I had to go through when it came to understanding what I should be or shouldn't be doing with respect to my compensation, negotiating it, or because I got, unfortunately, because I didn't understand those things, of what should be in a normal compensation agreement or employment agreement. I ended up getting burned in a couple of those, and my reward got significantly diminished. I'll just say that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great experience you have, Pat, with like how many startups you've worked at and everything. So yeah, if someone does want to chat to Pat, I highly recommend it. And if what any other resources, like kind of finishing up there, any other resources you'd recommend for individuals wanting to further educate themselves?
That's a great question, Dennis, and I may even defer back to you, but I would tell you this, as I was just describing, I unfortunately had to learn the hard way because compensation is such I'll say a taboo subject with employers and with, the employees and people that they're bringing on board, that I haven't found anything that kind of gave me the insights that I, gleaned out of my experience of having some comp plans go sideways on me, or when the M&A occurred, I didn't have the proper provisions in there, and I ended up getting nothing. And in some respects, it was like, and by the way, here's your severance, and see you later, right? So, so I don't know that I know of any kind of stuff online, or you could probably get it from like HR websites or blogs and stuff like that. But I would ask you, when you've gone through the process of evaluating an offer, an agreement, have you found any resources that are useful that you were
I would say great resources are like people who've been through it a few times more than you previously with similar kind of situations is like great resources. Any kind of like, people who've just been through it before. Any other resources? I would say, like in terms of the variable and base salary, there's actually a ton of data out there. So I would highly recommend, if you've ever worked with recruiting companies, or you are working with a recruiter, like that recruiter is actually getting paid for placing you.
Yeah.
So definitely they're a great resource, and there's great like benchmark data and stuff that they usually have that's pretty
Yeah.
accurate, I would say. And they have a great understanding of the market rates and stuff, even with the equity piece, I would say. I think like websites like Glassdoor and stuff, I don't know how much I trust it. I know Glassdoor is really big in the US. In Europe, maybe it's not as big, but
Yeah.
I would say then like, yeah, I would say getting a good feeling for the company you're going into. Like, I think actually advice you've given me before, Pat, as well, is like maybe make sure that like you're meeting some of the team that you're going to manage and inherit and stuff, kind of know what you're kind of like getting in for. And I think with the compensation piece and everything, yeah, this isn't really related to compensation, but like going to a smaller company, there's a lot of things you don't know yet. You can only learn so much, like from the outside in, and you mightn't get
Yeah.
given a cap table or other things.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
like your network and people you know who maybe worked there previously, or people who know any of the executive team and
Yeah.
kind of vouch for them and stuff, or
Yeah.
yeah, and make sure that you don't have like a bad gut feeling. Yeah, and dig into it a bit more if you do.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, Dennis, and I think that's good advice in terms of the with the recruiters and what are the comparable types of compensation components that are being in the agreements that they're negotiating for these executive level ones, because there's not as much data on that as opposed to individual contributors.
Yeah, yeah,
The
true.
only caution I give you there is that remember that the recruiter is kind
Mm,
of he's kind of
yeah,
like a real estate agent that's
yeah, yeah,
listing and selling the house.
yeah,
Right?
yeah,
It's kind of
yeah,
like they're a little
yeah,
bit compromised, but I would also say that maybe to your point, if you can go out and find other startup executives and kind of what their
yeah,
experience was, and maybe some investors too. Now, not every
yeah,
investor, especially venture capital people, really understand the operational side of it, but some of them are really good at it, and they can give you some tips of what to avoid or not or whatever.
yeah.
Because it's the same thing as
That's a great
recruiting, right?
point. Yeah,
They're they're the ones that are funding it, so they're going to try to get the best possible deal that's in their interest, right?
yeah,
So they can give you some sense of what the comparables are in that.
yeah,
And then as it relates to the company and try to decipher out as many things as you possibly can about the company. You're spot on there, Dennis. And that's a really important part when you're thinking about going to a company. I used to have like 2 pages of questions that I would ask about all the different functional aspects, because that is what tells me whether I think the company is going to be customer focused, sales and marketing driven, and organizationally enabled. And those are critical from a company cultural standpoint for you to be successful as a CRO. If they don't possess those, it's going to be tough for the
yeah,
CRO. I'll just say that.
yeah. Great advice. And one last one that came up,
Yeah.
and I think your point about the investors and financiers, I haven't been as close to that side of the market, but I think it's great advice. I think is actually, I was part of this group before called, it used to be called the Revenue Collective. Now it's called Pavilion, but that was great actually, because it was kind of non-biased advice from
Yeah.
peers and stuff. So that was good too. To Pat's point about reaching out to people in similar situations. So yeah, that's kind of
So
it.
hopefully that gives the people enough,
Yeah.
I'll say options or, to go try to hunt out and, get some advice.
Hopefully everyone found that was a useful episode today about compensation and thinking about maybe if you're thinking about your next jump in your career, or when that time comes, or maybe renegotiating maybe something that you're in right now. And
Yes.
yeah, thank you for tuning in to this episode. This was Closing Time with Pat and Denis. So thank you for joining. Goodbye.
The bar is closed. Thanks, Dane. See you next time.
Bye, Pat. Bye.